the idea here is that you have this dramatic dysfunction of your body in this incredibly important way. And yeah, you can mask it by putting more hormones on your skin and getting that into the bloodstream, but you never solved the question of why did this happen to you in the first place, which means you have no idea what the long-term ramification of that continuous harm to your body is going to be. The point of identifying the hormone dysfunction is like that's the canary in the coal mine that just died. You need to figure out what is going on that caused that and fix it as quickly as possible.
Dr. Elroy Vojdani, welcome to the Root Cause Medicine podcast. I'm so excited and honored to have you on today.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks, Carrie.
Well, we're talking about autoimmune disease, and this needs a lot of attention, and I couldn't think of a better person to break it all down. Not only the autoimmune that we know, such as Hashimoto's, rheumatoid arthritis, but even some of these sort of subtler or even what we'd call silent autoimmune. And having read your book, which is right behind me for those of you watching the video, and listened to you for years, I know that you just have this excellent way of breaking down what is autoimmune. We're going to talk about why is it on the rise, what's contributing to it, and then, of course, most importantly, what can we do?
I'm excited to talk about it. Let's dig in.
Let's start with the basic. Autoimmune. What is autoimmune? When somebody hears this, somebody with autoimmune may already know they have a disease name, but they may not understand the concept of what is autoimmune.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great way to jump into this. So we call autoimmune disease the cardinal sin of the immune system. And essentially, the immune system's job is to protect you from the outside world. Autoimmune disease is basically where the immune system makes a mistake in that attempt. So in its attempt to defend you, it accidentally starts attacking you. So you start attacking your own tissue, essentially, that leads to whatever tissue's being targeted being destroyed, and you become symptomatic from that attack, all from the intention of the immune system to originally help protect you from the environment.
And then I feel like, I haven't been following the trends, but I feel like it's on the rise.
You are correct.
Okay.
You are absolutely correct. Unfortunately, it is very dramatically on the rise. I mean, you can really focus on the last maybe 15 to 20 years and see an explosion of autoimmune disease really in the Western world, but also now starting to happen in the more third world and developing nations as well. So it's now at this point a global rise of autoimmune disease. Very hard to really pinpoint exactly how much of a rise, and that's part of, I think, our discussion here with autoimmunity, because currently the way we diagnose autoimmune disease is we wait until a patient is in what we call stage 3 of autoimmune disease before a formal diagnosis is made. That basically means that the autoimmune disease has occurred for somewhere between 2 to 8 years, sometimes even upwards of 12 to 15 years in that person's body before a physician gives them, a flag in the ground and says, this is your autoimmune disease. So, let's say currently we think maybe 40 to 70 million Americans have a known diagnosed autoimmune disease. That's up rather dramatically, somewhere on the order of 3% a year of an increase in the last 15 years. But we know that there's likely a larger pool of people out there that are on that stage 1 or 2 road to autoimmunity and will eventually end up, if nothing is done about it, in that camp of stage 3. So I think when you kind of extrapolate the data and the lag time to the diagnosis, we're having a conversation of maybe 20 to 25% of the US population of having some type of autoimmune condition, which is a staggering number.
That's a huge number. That's a massive number. Actually, that I want to get into, because when you say stage 3 autoimmune, can you give examples of sort of the top 5 or 10 conditions that people are probably familiar with?
Yeah, so Hashimoto's, I think most people in the functional and integrative space will be familiar with. It is the most common autoimmune disease. So that's an autoimmune disease against the thyroid gland. After that, we see a whole host of autoimmune diseases in the gut, like Crohn's and other inflammatory bowel diseases, ulcerative colitis. There are autoimmune diseases of the joints, which are really prevalent, unfortunately. Rheumatoid arthritis, ankylosing spondylitis, psoriatic arthritis. And then, the neurological ones, MS is definitely the most famous there, and unfortunately rather prevalent and significantly on the rise. That's kind of the more tissue-specific autoimmune diseases. And then there are those that people suffer from a more general autoimmunity that ends up impacting their organs, with lupus being, the most prevalent and common there.
And then going back to stage 1 or stage 2, how would somebody even know that they're there? Like, why doesn't the current medical model address that? Why do they wait until we're just going to wait and see, we're going to keep testing you until you're positive and then we'll address it? What are people looking for if they're back in stage 1 or 2? How do they know?
You just gave me a very big soapbox to stand on right now.
Go for it.
So unfortunately, the model in medicine right now is to be reactive rather than proactive. That really means until all of the boxes are checked in an algorithm, we don't have formal diagnoses here in the traditional Western model. That doesn't work with something like autoimmune disease. I think you can make an argument that really is very inefficient and not optimal for any disease on the planet. But in particular with autoimmune disease, it's problematic because in the reactive approach, by the time somebody's in stage 3, that's an irreversible state. They're stuck in that autoimmunity indefinitely. There's nothing that anybody could ever do about it. And they've already lost some of their tissue, whatever the target was, and they'll never recover it. So stage 1 and 2, identifying it is very important. And I think changing the way we do things is really important. So I'll break down these stages for you. So, we said that autoimmunity is where the immune system makes a mistake in defense and starts attacking your own tissue. Again, that attack can happen for anywhere from 2 to 15 years before you're in full-blown stage 3. So stage 1 is essentially the first moment that the immune system starts targeting those tissues with antibodies. So you're making antibodies to, let's say in the case of Hashimoto's, the thyroid gland. And, let's say the clinical symptoms are virtually non-existent at that point because not enough time or inflammation has occurred for the person who has those antibodies to notice. That's stage 1. Stage 2 is those antibodies have been floating around in the system for a period of time, months, years. It depends on the autoimmune disease, but enough time for inflammation to start occurring systemically and also at the target of those antibodies. And now there are vague, unusual, and unhealthy symptoms. So this is where people start complaining about joint pain for the first time, brain fog, fatigue, digestive discomfort, all the things that we kind of, laser focus on in functional and integrative medicine. That's where people start complaining of those things, right? The antibodies are present in the blood at that stage as well, too. But because the symptoms themselves don't fully fall into a bucket of, let's say, rheumatoid arthritis or MS or inflammatory bowel disease, they don't get called clinically autoimmune disease, but the antibodies are still present. So it's actually quite straightforward how we change this paradigm. In stage 1 and stage 2, the autoantibodies are present in the blood. They're very easy to detect. We just need to take an approach of screening patients for autoimmune disease, either as just part of general health screening, I think, which is ideal, or let's say if somebody shows up to a practitioner's office and is complaining about these vague symptoms, that, red flag needs to go off in the back of our mind and we need to start screening for autoimmunity. Because, again, if you're catching that person in stage 1 or stage 2, those are reversible autoimmune conditions. You can save them from the horrific road that is potentially waiting for them going forward.
This is so interesting because years and years and years ago, when I was joining an integrative clinic that was owned by a MD who was looking to become more integrative, so she wanted to hire me on. We were going through a patient case that we shared, and she was flipping through the chart, because back when we had charts, nothing was totally online yet. And she said, her thyroid peroxidase antibodies are positive, TPO, whatever that means. And she flipped the chart and kept going. And I said, stop. That's a Hashimoto's autoimmune. That's an antibody for Hashimoto's. And she said, well, I don't know what that means. I said, that's autoimmune thyroid. And she said, well, her TSH is normal. Like, what do we do? Just put her on thyroid hormone? Like, there's nothing we can do. And I thought, oh my gosh, I had been heavily trained in what to do. And it was shocking how much this family physician had zero training. Now, she is completely 180'd since that time and has become quite an expert in it. But even way back then, I thought, oh, this is a big problem. It's getting ignored and pushed off of, yes, you have antibodies. No, there's nothing we can do until you're stage 3. And you're saying absolutely not. Stage 1 or stage 2, of course, there's a lot you can do.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much you can do because when you understand the mechanisms of development of autoimmunity, you can reverse engineer the problem and successfully backtrack those steps. And the basic formula there is autoimmune disease is 2/3 environmental, 1/3 genetic. And obviously, the environment plays the bigger role in that calculation. Therefore, that's something that we have control over for our patients, and patients have control over for themselves. So once you specifically identify what the environmental triggers are for that person's autoimmunity, you absolutely have a map for stepping them backwards out of stage 1 and stage 2.
Actually, let me ask you this. So in the testing of antibodies, there's a whole slew of antibodies for a whole slew of conditions we can test for.
Mm-hmm.
Regardless of somebody, what they're positive for, it sounds like, and I know just having listened to you before, that a lot of the approach, again, as you said, reverse engineer, find out what the triggers are for that person. It almost doesn't matter so much which antibody is positive because we're not treating the antibody per se. We're treating what the instigating reason is or the triggers, the environmental part of it.
Yeah, you're correct there, right? You want to really identify what was the environmental path that led to this, and that's not ever really a single thing. It's really more of a multi-year road travel. So you really just have to, go through a really good history and find out what were the missteps on that road. Sometimes the specific antibody can give you some clues as to what I would say the trigger that broke the camel's back was because of cross-reactivity. Like, for example, we know with multiple sclerosis, 2 big ones are Epstein-Barr virus and also a issue with immune reactivity to dairy proteins because of what we call cross-reactivity, essentially between that and nervous system tissue. So, in those cases, there are some things that for sure you can look at on the road, but overall, autoimmunity just tells you've got to look at the environmental past of that person and really just start cleaning things up.
All right, let's get into the big list, though. Obviously, we can't identify every single trigger on this podcast, but when you are doing a mental rundown of what would be on that journey, what we need to look for, what do we look for people listening to go, how do I even begin to start to find my environmental trigger?
Well, number 1, 2, and 3 on the list are we look at what's going on in the gut. And I think in particular, start paying close attention to whether there are issues with foods or intestinal permeability or dysbiosis. I think, those are extremely high yield areas of investigation when it comes to autoimmunity. And the reason for that is very straightforward. Everything, if you kind of like put a calculation into what we're exposed to in the environment, there's no larger exposure than what we're eating on a regular basis. That's a way that we put the external environment inside of us on a regular basis. So, food, what happens downstream from food, that's really where you want to look the most. And I think it's good to see that the scientific literature is starting to echo how important that area is in the world of autoimmunity as well.
Can you explain for those maybe who are new to the podcast, how would dysbiosis or leaky gut contribute to the development of autoimmune or antibodies?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have, as humans, interfaces with the outside world that are very, very critical to our overall health and well-being. The skin is an interface, our, mouth is an interface, the lungs are an interface, and further downstream from the mouth, we have the most important interface at all, and that is the small intestinal lining. In the small intestinal lining, we have a single layer of cells that has an incredibly complex and difficult task. It needs to be able to differentiate between friend or foe, essentially, from what we eat. So, sifting through all of that chemical and biological information is it's a lot. So, under normal circumstances, we can identify a threat in our food. Let's say it's a bacteria or a toxin, and make sure that we're not absorbing that. And we can see something that's nutritious and make sure that we're absorbing that. Unfortunately, because of the very large amount, I think, of both environmental chemical exposure, and I think I throw, unfortunately, environmental stress in modern society as a number two there, we see a breakdown of that essential function of the interface very, very commonly. So that's really what we call leaky gut. But it's basically the interface of your small intestine not being able to decipher good or bad inside of the gut anymore. And essentially the gate that would normally be closed in that situation to keep the bad stuff away gets stuck in an open position. The next thing you know, the immune system has far more of a sifting process to go through than it anticipated because those gates are open. Now you've got food coming through, you've got bacteria coming through, you've got chemicals coming through. And, I think from the immune system's perspective, it basically just takes an approach of, well, I don't know what's good or bad here anymore. And it will start attacking things that it otherwise would not have, like food, that we're not supposed to really be designed to attack at all. And unfortunately, again, there's lots of proteins in food that look very similar to the proteins of our tissue. So the mistake happens there where that gate is stuck open, you start attacking a particular food because the immune system can't tell anymore. And by attacking that food, you accidentally attack your own tissue. That's really the basic mechanism of autoimmune disease.
So you mentioned like MS earlier, and dairy is an example. So if your gates are stuck open, you have a lot of small intestinal leaky gut, you are consuming a lot of dairy, your immune system's overwhelmed and confused and goes, this protein is close enough, it looks like neurological tissue, we're going to tag it as bad. So now every time you eat dairy, when before, make sure I'm getting this right, whereas before it's like, that's just dairy, it's fine. Now it's like, nope, that looks like neuro tissue, and then goes and attacks, like gets confused and goes and attacks neuro tissue. Is that correct?
That's correct. Absolutely. You're attacking dairy when you never did before. And when you consume dairy, the antibodies get produced in the gut. Some of it spills into the blood. Some of that ends up binding to nervous system tissue. Whereas before, you would never form antibodies to dairy because you didn't have leaky gut. So that was never a problem for you. And that's really step one in the development of a food-related autoimmune disease.
What other common foods do you see are the sort of, once you develop into this leaky gut, like right away, or like dairy and MS, are there other food groups and other autoimmunities you tend to see over and over?
Yeah, we've I've been fortunate enough to work with my dad in his research lab for a long time. And, part of the work that we do is really trying to map this out so that clinicians have very specific places that they can go to, because, in the world of food, how do you know what the triggers are? It's a humongous map. So we've actually done the work in several autoimmune diseases. So for Hashimoto's, for example, the largest trigger is gluten, without question, for somebody who's specifically TPO antibody positive. And then next on the list would be a protein in soy called soy agglutinin. And then after that, there's a agglutinin protein in legumes or beans. So specifically for TPO, we know those three things are top of the list. We know with MS, it's dairy. We know with type 1.5 diabetes, which is called LADA, it is also dairy. We know with rheumatoid arthritis, when somebody has a positive rheumatoid factor, it is the global lectin food that can cause the actual formation of those rheumatoid factor antibodies. So every autoimmune disease is unique, but there are like kind of common themes overall in autoimmunity about the potential trigger foods. Gluten, dairy, soy, lectins, maybe corn and eggs go further down that list.
Wow. Now, you mentioned Epstein-Barr earlier with MS. Are there other bacteria or viruses, again, that similar to foods give this cross-reactivity or give this kickoff for autoimmune?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the environmental bucket, food is definitely the largest, kind of piece that we look at, but it's not the only part of the environment that can cause this haywire defense from the immune system that ends up attacking us. Pathogens, organisms, viruses, bacteria, parasites, they're next on that list because they are, quite frankly, the next most common thing that we're exposed to. And there are several viruses in particular that are notorious for causing autoimmune disease. The two largest ones prior to SARS-CoV-2 were Epstein-Barr virus and a very close relative called human herpes virus type 6. And because of their protein structures, when we start attacking those viruses, they can attach to our tissue and cause a lot of specifically neurologic autoimmunity. In that same kind of thought process, we're trying to defend ourselves against the virus. We form antibodies against them. They unfortunately look a lot like our nervous system tissue, so we end up attacking our own nervous system tissue. Several in the world of bacteria as well. There are, let's say the common causes of foodborne illness like Salmonella, Shigella. They carry antibodies. We can form antibodies to a toxin that they have that will actually create an autoimmune post-infectious IBS picture for patients. Several bacteria can cause rheumatoid arthritis. We know with Klebsiella, it can cause something called ankylosing spondylitis. So there are many pathogen variant autoimmune diseases out there as well too.
This is always so fascinating to me because just over the years, the number of maybe Western conventional doctors I've talked to or consulted with or co-managed a patient with who said, well, it's autoimmune. We don't know. We don't know what kicks it off. We don't know it. So we have no idea. And it's a massive breath of fresh air to hear you so confidently, like the research is finally catching up. Here's what we're seeing. Here's what we know. Here's my book. And there is a lot we can do, which we're going to get into. But for everyone listening who has autoimmune or has a loved one with autoimmune who's really been struggling, like this must be so maddening for people to learn, really this whole time, there's something I could have done besides nothing or major pharmaceutical intervention.
I'm upset on their behalf, honestly. And that's why I decided to, change my medical career and jump into specifically trying to help with the autoimmune disease world, because it is maddening. You get that diagnosis. A lot of times, patients will go to a rheumatologist with these kind of stage 2 vague complaints and get these like meaningless vague diagnoses like undifferentiated connective tissue disease and essentially just get recommended to do nothing and watch and wait, which, I can't think of a more horrifying experience and the opposite of what you're looking for when you go to a physician's office in that case. So yeah, there's a lot of frustration out there. I've gone through obviously all of the Western training and did 4 years of medical school and 6 years of internship, residency, and fellowship. I've been in that world for a long time. And unfortunately, the education just isn't there right now. The knowledge is out there in the scientific world, but from a medical school perspective and training perspective, we just don't get educated on that front. And I think luckily we're seeing that starting to very slowly change, and things do in general very slowly change in medicine. But, I work very closely with rheumatologists here in Los Angeles, and they're starting to really understand this concept and they actually will start to do a lot of these investigations themselves now, which is, I think, very, very encouraging, especially compared to where we were 8 years ago when I first started practicing this.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. I want to go back and make sure I'm not missing any buckets. We've talked about food and leaky gut. We've talked about pathogens. Are there other buckets that I'm missing?
Bucket number 3 is chemicals, environmental chemicals, it's a messy bucket, Carrie.
Yeah, it's a big bucket.
So chemicals can cause autoimmunity in really 2 very specific ways. maybe three. Two very clear ones would be, number one, chemicals can cause leaky gut. So, that's the same, just like a different pathway into the same mechanism we talked at the beginning, but instead of a food or a stressor causing leaky gut, it's directly being caused by a chemical. You might ask what chemicals cause leaky gut, and we will come up with a list of several hundred of them, maybe even thousands, because unfortunately, many, many, many synthetic chemicals cause leaky gut. Many medications that many Americans take regularly cause leaky gut. It's an exhaustive list, but some of the highlights would be food additives like gums, food colorings, BPA-like compounds and cousins that show up in products that are listed as BPA free. So don't get fooled by that. I think honestly, when you go through the medication list, it's quite shocking. Everything from, Advil and NSAIDs that patients take all the time, proton pump inhibitors. There's even a suggestion that SSRIs cause intestinal permeability. It's a maddening list. To make it more maddening, chemicals can directly cause autoimmunity as well too. They do that by binding to our own tissue. So, I would love to think that human beings are chemicals in, chemicals out, but unfortunately that's not the case. Some of them stay within us. They can bind to our own tissue. In binding to the tissue, they change the structure of it, and they form a new protein structure that the immune system is not used to seeing, and therefore it'll start attacking. We see a lot of that with autoimmune liver diseases. So, there are many ways and an indefinite list of chemicals that they can impact us, which I think sometimes is overwhelming for patients. But I think as long as you stick to the most common and basic chemicals and try to minimize your exposure to them, a lot of us can make a really big difference in the way that we interact with our environment.
I was talking to a microbiologist once who said, a lot of these chemicals, antimicrobials, for example, they are tested to make sure they won't kill a human. But what we don't test is to see if they won't kill a microbiome. And that's their job. Their job is to kill microbes, of which the human is made up of trillions of them. And so to think it's not going to affect our microbiome, either on our skin, in our, mouth, all the way down through the intestines is just crazy. And we are exposed to just that set of chemicals all the time, let alone all the other environmental chemicals, all the medications, etc. It's definitely overwhelming and horrifying at the same time.
It is, but at the same time, I think it's good that we're seeing large portions of people out there starting to become aware of this, starting to take self-interest. Functional and integrative medicine is very much like a grassroots campaign for health, I think, driven by the people out there and understanding that they're going to have to do something on their own if they're going to be healthy in today's world. And luckily, the information to be able to do that is more widespread than ever.
And we're seeing it even now, even just the rise up against large cereal companies, for example, to get food dyes out and colorings out and all this crap out that we don't need. In fact, I was just in Europe lecturing, and when you read ingredients on ketchup or their cereal, it's very, very different. Same title of the cereal, same but different ingredients, different. It's cleaner, so to speak.
It is absolutely ridiculous what we allow in this country compared to what other countries have identified as toxic for human beings and will not allow to be used.
Yeah.
Food coloring's probably top of the list. Hopefully that changes sometime soon.
Oh my gosh, I hope so. All right, well let's get into the what can you do. Let's be very proactive, because I know now people are going, well, crap. But the good thing is, and this is why I had Dr. Elroy on, is because he has a lot of suggestions, solutions. Again, he has a book, a lot of write-ups. So let's go through the basics. When you see somebody for the first time and you're educating them about all of this, where do you start with somebody?
I start with a really thorough history. There are obviously places that I, know to look at this point, depending on, what kind of condition they're coming in with. But, just kind of going back to the bread and butter of my practice, it's really just talking about like, what are you eating? How are you moving? How are you sleeping? What are you being mindful of as far as your exposure is concerned? What are your stress reduction techniques? I think all of those things really compose what we think of as a person's environment in the functional medicine world, and they really are, and all of them make a huge impact. So we really start off with mapping all of those essentials, and that's just sitting down across the table and talking about life and figuring out what they do. And my job there is to identify where the strengths and weaknesses are and work on the weaknesses. I think very often what they eat is the easiest place to work on, and specifically removing toxin-filled foods, inflammatory foods, things that are anti-nutritious, and really trying to bring the nutrition back into their diet. That's a lot of work, but extremely high yield from a clinical perspective. And then, hitting the movement, the sleep, the stress reduction, I think it's shockingly underrepresented in people's overall, map of what they do during a day these days. So it's starting with the basics, getting really as much of a perfectionist with the basics as life will allow. That's really where we start. It doesn't really involve fancy laboratory testing or anything magic until we get past that point.
All right, let's move past that point. What do you do next when you get, I have to ask, do you do laboratory testing? Do you do stool testing? What are we looking at here?
Yeah, I come from a scientific research background before medical school, and then, a traditional medical school. So, the objective data is an important part of the workup, depending on the need for it. In my practice, we see autoimmune disease all day, every day, right? So autoimmune disease requires blood work to be, I think, precise and to know exactly what you're doing. So there is a lot of blood work that we do in the practice. Again, I'm only going to do it when I feel like somebody has started making progress in the foundational stuff, because I think otherwise it's pointless. But we do a lot. I think we do a lot of intestinal permeability testing, which my opinion and research is that that's best done with blood testing. We do a lot of autoimmune screening. So that's, seeing what type of autoantibodies are present, whether they're, something as simple as an ANA or a double-strand DNA, which are more general markers of autoimmunity, or if we're doing more advanced panels that look at myelin basic protein and other neurological target antibodies in the blood, or things like rheumatoid factor, joint related stuff. We do a lot of screening for autoantibodies. That doesn't necessarily have to be done with out of insurance specialty labs. A lot of it can be done through insurance, and we try to maximize that. And I think again, a lot of cases that come my way are very difficult to solve mystery cases. So the next step would be trying to identify where the specific environmental triggers are beyond that. So that's where we get to food immune reactivity testing. Issues with pathogens like viruses would be through blood. We do stool testing for, bacterial issues, microbiome, the inflammatory markers in stool. We do a lot of hormone testing in the practice as well, because, the connection between the immune system and hormones is one-to-one. And I think that's one of the most common ways that we see immunological dysfunction is with hormone dysfunction. I know I'm preaching to the choir right now, but we do a lot of hormone testing. It's really a matter of who comes in and how much the stuff is necessary. But depending on the person, there's some data that gets grabbed, and others, a lot of data gets grabbed.
You mentioned earlier intestinal permeability testing through blood work as opposed through other means. What do you do for that?
So the protein that we talked about, that's the gate of the intestinal barrier, is something called zonulin. Zonulin is actually the key that controls the gait, essentially. So, there were some initial tests that came out that looked for levels of zonulin in the blood, and also you could potentially measure zonulin in the stool. We actually did a clinical study where we looked at, a group of normal controls and then also celiac disease patients, and found essentially that when you look at zonulin in the blood, it fluctuates way too much because it has a really short half-life. So thankfully, the immune system isn't used to seeing zonulin in the blood. So when it does end up in the blood, it'll form an antibody to it. And antibodies have a really long half-life, on the order of days to weeks, depending on the antibodies. So we found that antibodies were much more stable, and therefore, a better way to measure against zonulin, if you're looking for leaky gut. And at the same time, you can look for bacterial toxins in the blood that shouldn't be there, and the immune system will form antibodies to those, particularly lipopolysaccharide. As far as the stool zonulin is concerned, my issue is basically with how reliable extracting a purified protein out of stool might be. And this is me being a lab geek. I apologize, but I spend a lot of time in the lab, so I can't help myself. But I have a hard time believing that you can get a purified piece of zonulin out of stool and reliably measure that. So that's why I believe blood antibodies against zonulin and lipopolysaccharide are the most accurate way to detect intestinal permeability.
Which I think is great to know, because there are some differing opinions out there. But as a lab geek, a self-professed lab geek, that's the information I want to hear from. I want to hear from somebody who's in the lab all day long and really elbows deep in the literature.
That's me. That's my
you.
hobby.
Now, I want to go back to hormones for a second. We touched on this right before we started recording, because, of course, hormones are right up my alley. I'd be remiss if I didn't say something, is that I'm seeing it with my own eyes, with my own patients, women going through the perimenopausal and menopausal transition. Their changes in their GI tract are much more significant than originally thought, and contributing to a lot of inflammation because of the change in hormones affecting their gaits and their microbiome diversity, et cetera. Are you seeing in your practice that as women are in this age group, in the late 30s into their 50s, that their autoimmune goes up?
Yeah, a lot. I'd say there's maybe two dominant patterns that I see where we see a big prevalence of autoimmunity in the female population specifically. And I'd love to hear your experience in the space. But I'd say the first would be late 30s, early 40s, symptomatic perimenopause for sure, and starting to have significant intestinal and autoimmune issues simultaneously. So, in my mind, there's a very large population of women out there that are going through, I think, perimenopause and menopause earlier, and inappropriately earlier than they should be. And we see that correlate with the autoimmune and gut stuff. And then, we've seen a lot of what people look like as metabolically healthy PCOS in a younger population, not your kind of stereotypical medical textbook PCOS case. And they will also have chronic inflammatory or autoimmune conditions simultaneously as well, too.
Interesting. I definitely see, I would say, the perimenopausal over and over. Not only do I see it, but I hear it in the comments of social media, in the DMs, just in the way they describe themselves. I'm like, oh, I can see what's going on. I know what's going on. And it's not taught. It's not being taught. In fact, when you search the literature for it, it's very few and far between up until about 2020, 2022. And now we're starting to get this roll of research around, oh, dang, as women go through the perimenopausal transition, not only does it affect the cardiometabolic, the brain, right, the neurologic, all the female stuff, but it's also affecting her GI tract, which is then affecting her entire system because, as you said, the gates are open. Besides the food, the chemicals, and the pathogens, we have the change in hormones contributing to the gates being open and adding to a fourth bucket for these women. And I'm like, Elroy, this is not fair.
It's always been unfair, I guess, with women being 3 times more likely to suffer from autoimmune disease in the first place.
Yeah.
It certainly is a very difficult, complex web for that group of people out there, for sure.
Do you see any of this with men if they lose testosterone or at any major age changes for men equivalently?
Only every single day.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I was going to mention that the other group that mirrors that is the, I'd say somewhere in the late 30s to early 50-year-old men. The prevalence of low testosterone in our patient population is incredibly high. I would venture it's as high as 50% in that group right now. Again, it's a selected bias group because they're coming to meet, but we see it all the time. So that connection between immunological dysfunction and hormone dysfunction is absolutely there for men as well, too.
I do want to clarify. I said, oh, good, not because I'm glad they get this, but I'm glad we're talking about this. Men often are forgotten. Women are usually discussed the most. They tend to go to the doctor. Perimenopause, menopause is having a whole moment experience movement right now. And as a result, low testosterone in men isn't being discussed. 100%. Yep.
I think we see pretty clearly in the community that prevalence is being recognized, because what I see as common practice, at least in my community here with GYNs, is we're seeing earlier usage of things like estradiol patches and progesterone. So I think GYNs are recognizing that people are going through this hormone dysfunction earlier, but just, kind of saying, okay, well, we need to give you more hormones. And, anybody who has looked into the testosterone replacement space in the United States will find just an absolute explosion of especially remote TRT clinics because of this prevalence. And again, the answer from their perspective is, well, you just need more testosterone, which, gives me the heebie-jeebies because the idea here is that you have this dramatic dysfunction of your body in this incredibly important way. And yeah, you can mask it by putting more hormones on your skin and getting that into the bloodstream, but you never solved the question of why did this happen to you in the first place, which means you have no idea what the long-term ramification of that continuous harm to your body is going to be. The point of identifying the hormone dysfunction is like that's the canary in the coal mine that just died. You need to figure out what is going on that caused that and fix it as quickly as possible, because you otherwise are going to end up in this bucket of 15 to 20% of the population with neurodegenerative disease, early cancer, autoimmune disease later on in life, which we're seeing all the time. So, it's easy to solve it just with more hormones, but please make sure you take that and you decide to dig into it and figure out what's going on.
And I'm especially seeing the hormone replacement early. Like I'm having practitioners call me about a 25-year-old male with low testosterone saying, how much testosterone do I put him on? I'm like, no, he's 25. Let's find out why he's low T. And same for women. She's 25 with low progesterone or low estrogen, or she's not cycling. I'm just going to go ahead and put her on hormones. I'm like, maybe we should figure out why a 25-year-old isn't cycling and doesn't have these hormones, because that's the bigger issue.
Yeah. So just because a clinic will give it to you doesn't mean you should take it. Please have somebody do the work and dig into it for you.
And honestly, I hope everyone's taken away, it's a pretty integrated, it's a holistic approach. The very first thing Dr. Elroy said wasn't for autoimmunity, pharmaceuticals, medications, or hormones. He was like, we need the foundations. Like we call it functional medicine, but really it should be foundational medicine, because that's what we harp on all the time and trying to teach our patients that they need to focus on: what you eat, how you sleep, your joy, your community, your love, your movement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's what we're missing out on.
Absolutely. Pull yourself out of the rat race, take a breath, pay attention to what you're doing, and start working on living in a quality of life that you deserve.
Absolutely. You deserve. Yes, absolutely. Because everyone deserves this. And I think some people are missing that part of the message. All right. As we wrap up, is there anything else that I missed? Is there any key thing you are just dying to say? I have one more soapbox, Carrie. I need to say this.
um, not really so much of a soapbox. I really hinted at it at the beginning where I talked about, emotional stress. I really feel more than ever, every single year, maybe for the last 5 or 6 years in being practiced, that you just kind of feel like this growing emotional angst in the patient population out there. And I really think sometimes we underrepresent how much that is a role player in the immune system and autoimmunity. And in general, just this immune dysfunction that we're seeing on a population basis. So it's just another reminder. I think patients are very surprised when I quote a really good study that was done at the University of Pittsburgh with MS patients. I think this is in 2014. They were trying to track what triggered the flares of MS. MS is this disease that unfortunately in its nature has this waxing and waning activity. And every time you have a flare, you unfortunately permanently lose a part of your neurological function. So they were trying to identify what happened to that person that caused the flare. And 80% of the people with flares reported a significant emotionally distressful event happening prior to that. So, as much as we want to say, science and everything might save us from these things, I think, just taking a look inside, taking a breath, and doing something to help yourself on the emotional front as this world dives deeper into chaos is a very important thing.
I absolutely love that message. One of the questions that I did mean to tell you or ask you, it was on the list, was around trauma and how trauma might impact the development or progression of autoimmune. And while trauma is likely a huge part, even just the everyday emotional adds to that bucket as well.
100%.
Oh my gosh. This has been a fantastic conversation. I will have to have you back to do a part 2 because I know there are going to be a lot of questions. There is a lot of autoimmune out there. Where can people find you, more importantly?
So our clinic is in Los Angeles. The name of the clinic is Regenera Medical. The website is regeneramedical.com. I do my best to, kind of get out there and give lectures and do podcasts to just help with just public free information as much as possible. So you can find quite a few of those on YouTube that I've done. I wrote, I hope, a quick, easy book that people can get as a primer, at least related to the food stuff. And it's called When Food Bites Back. And it's on Amazon, so you can get a copy of that book.
Which I highly, highly recommend it. For those of you watching the video, you will see it right behind me, propped up, because I have it in my bookshelf to show people. Well, Dr. Elroy, thank you so much for coming on the Root Cause Medicine podcast. This has been absolutely phenomenal. We will have all your links linked in the show notes, and I really appreciate you coming on.
It was my pleasure, Carrie. Thank you.